So here's the question. In the print and packaging supply chain, how do we deliver new ideas and innovative practices to continually improve your profit, your brand, and your quality? Welcome to the Gamut Podcast, and I am your host, Jeff Collins, Director of Print Technologies for ID Alliance. We are a nonprofit global think tank serving the graphic communications industry with 12 offices strategically located around the world to better support our membership. You can support the Gamut Podcast and content like this by becoming a member at ID Alliance by going to www.idalliance.org. I would also like to thank Konica Minolta for sponsoring this podcast. They are a world leader in industrial and commercial printing and packaging solutions. On today's Gamut Podcast, we have the pleasure of hearing from Mark Gunlock. He is an X-Rite solution architect and has over 24 years experience working in photography, design, and print environments. He's a graduate of Kent State University in journalism and photo illustration and worked for 7 years as a commercial photographer and was one of the first to adopt and use digital photography and color management in a commercial studio. Mark was an early advocate of fully digital workflow processes and later used his experience as a system integrator to install and train users on color management, pre-press production, press room process control, and digital workflow leading practices. Mark is a certified ID Alliance G7 expert, an Apple Color Management Pro and color management trainer, and has helped hundreds of companies take control of their workflows over 17 years of professional training experience. Welcome, Mark. How are you today?
Doing wonderful. And yourself?
Excellent. And today we have a lot to discuss, and we're going to talk about Pantone CMYK builds, and we're also going to discuss Pantone guides and extended color gamut. So we're covering a lot of topics. And so, Mark, to get started, I'd love to talk about CMYK builds for Pantone spot colors and the often confusing situations that we get into. Give us a little help here for designers that are preparing files that are, dictating possibly brand identity guidelines, and the use of spot colors and CMYK builds and setting the right expectations and understanding the reality of that often confusing scenario where we get into CMYK builds that cannot reproduce the spot color properly, but they are embedded into the file that the designer has provided.
Yeah. So the whole thing about how designers use Pantone colors and try to get to CMYK builds within our Adobe apps, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of confusion over that and how they need to get that conversion. And when they look at their published Pantone book and it has certain numbers in it, and then they open up Illustrator and they see different numbers, and they scratch their head and say, well, why is this not working?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's, kind of start with the basics. I'm a designer. I need to reproduce Home Depot orange within a spec, or possibly Reflex blue is the color we're going with, or could be something simple like, Pantone 186.
Yeah. So first of all, they need to understand that the Pantone colors actually were not born as CMYK colors. They're born as colors that were created in an ink room where the ink tech has 18 different pigments that he's working with, 18 different colorants that he can mix. And usually he'll pick 3 or 4 of those to create that color. Okay, so to create that orange, they're going to pull up that Home Depot orange. They're going to pull up an orange pigment, and they may add a little bit of a red pigment to it, and something else in there. But those aren't things that we have in CMYK, right? So those aren't achievable within the gamut of CMYK. And they're going to run, and like you mentioned, Reflex blue. Well, that is one of those colorants, okay? And you can't reproduce that with CMYK, right?
Yes.
So they need to understand that first and foremost, there's a lot of colors. Probably about 45% of the colors in the book are not achievable in CMYK. So already half of them, they're not going to be able to get a good match. When I say achievable, I mean like probably, acceptable match, like somewhere under 2 delta E.
Right.
So, right. So when they're working with those colors, if it's really critical to hit that color, like that Home Depot orange, if it's in a packaging type scenario, you're going to want to run it as a spot color. You don't want to try to build that out of CMYK. Now, what you can do to kind of get a kind of a reality test here is if you don't rely on what you see on your display in your applications and such there, it's probably a good idea to have a Pantone color bridge because that actually has the formula built color patches right next to the CMYK built version of that. And if it looks pretty good in the bridge guide, then it's probably going to be reproducible pretty well for your needs. The bridge guide, the CMYK that's in there, is printed to a line pretty close to what Grackle. So in that, if your printing environment is something close to that, then you can expect to get pretty similar results to what we got in the book.
Mark, what kind of information would you provide us to people that are still using, old Pantone libraries, or they're, providing essentially worthless brand identity guidelines or instructions for reproducing Pantone colors that are no longer exist in the applications like Adobe Creative Suite. So, keeping up to date on swatch books as well as the electronic libraries.
As of 2010, the values for those Pantone colors all got locked down. So you kind of alluded to the old books and stuff. If you had anything, any libraries, digital libraries, even prior to 2010, you shouldn't be using those, okay? Because they may have different LAB values associated with those colors. From 2010 on, that's our color DNA. We locked it down, and from that point forward, those values, those color names have the same LAB value. The only thing we change with the libraries from 2010 on is adding new colors. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a fine way to communicate, your desired spot colors there is just using a Pantone name in that regard. If I'm working with a library that's newer than 2010 and you're my print provider and you're working with that same library and I simply ask for Pantone 285, we're speaking the same thing there. You pull it up in your system, it's the same as mine, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one acceptable way to work with it. That's one nice thing about Pantone. It's very universal now, okay, in that regard. Now, the biggest mistake I see with the communications of brand standard colors is when you kind of mentioned there is when I've got maybe I define my brand color as a Pantone color, but then I also give you a CMYK or even worse, just an RGB value.
Yeah.
And I don't tell you what color space are we working with here, right? Here's a CMYK number. This is what it has to be. Well, I should not, as a brand, I should not be dictating to you as a printer, here's the CMYK values for my color in just a vacuum like that. We have to have some other communication, like I need to understand what standard you're printing to. So if we have an agreement that you're going to print to Grackle or to Swap or some other print standard,
yeah,
I need to communicate the CMYK values that are right for that standard if I'm going to dictate that. Or if we're in a situation where, actually we're seeing a lot more people doing extended gamut now, right?
Yes.
Right? Well, yeah. The extended gamut, there is really no standard per se around that, right?
Not yet.
Right? Not yet. Yeah. But if you're good at your extended gamut work, and I'm trusting you to print my work, and let's say that Home Depot orange, that's not even a Pantone color, but whatever. If I can give you either the Pantone color or good CXF data that represents my color, okay, that's spectral, okay, I just need to tell you this is the color I want you to hit, and leave it up to you to figure out what the CMYK orange, green, violet build is. Right. So,
right.
So I think one of the key things here is we have to whether it's a custom brand color or Pantone, they all need to be rooted in spectral data to start with. And Pantone is. And that's what we really need to have for our brand colors. It should be spectral data. And if we're going to hand these around, we should be storing this data in CXF format. And exchanging it. That's in fact the name. CXF is color exchange format, right? So that's what we should be using to exchange these colors.
How can we best, Mark, how can we best provide that exchange format, CXF, through the supply chain, the print supply chain? Where does it start? And how do we use CXF to exchange that spectral data?
In order to make a proper CXF that people can use throughout the whole supply chain, it's really going to need to be something that's made out of a color application like that is used by ink professionals, for example, and people are doing QC of production, where they can actually record spectral data into that CXF. One of the mistakes I see that people do out there is I'm not even sure where they're making these files, but they'll have a CXF that only has LAB data in it.
Right.
And, when it comes to color, the actual color really should be rooted in spectral data. The spectral data can be interpreted under different kinds of conditions. And our industry has, depending on where you're coming from in our industry, you may have different illuminant and observer standards, D65 versus D50, 2 degree versus 10 degree.
Yeah.
And we've kind of inherited some of this baggage from legacy data. The ink rooms would sometimes do D65, but yet you got your press rooms doing D50 and some weird stuff like that. We're trying to get everybody on the same page of D50, 2 degree. Mm-hmm. But there's still some legacy garbage out there. And people need to understand you can't just take an LAB of D65, for example, and just somehow magically convert it over to D50. Now, if I have spectral data, I can do that.
Right.
But I can't take an LAB to LAB effectively. Some of the larger brands out there are actually asking that the ink companies formulate the ink in such a way that they'll reduce the color flop that it'll have, the metamerism, between different illuminants. So if I'm looking at it under daylight conditions, I'm looking at my package under daylight conditions versus store light conditions.
Yes.
Right? They'll actually ask that the ink company formulate to get a good match under both D50 and cool white fluorescent or something like that. And you can't do that with just LAB. You have to have spectral to be able to do that.
Are there certain colors, Pantone colors, ranges of Pantone colors? Maybe they're pastels or maybe they're, highly saturated hues. Are they more susceptible to changes in lighting conditions going from retail to a standardized lighting booth?
I'm not aware of specific colors that would have that issue. But if I just plug in an LAB value into my software, it's going to calculate to do its math. It may need to calculate a spectral curve. If you plug it into your software, it may calculate a different spectral curve. Both of those curves are valid for getting to that LAB, but they're very different. And here's a real scenario that people run into is I have some ink guy creating ink for a label. Let's say it's going to go on this bottle, and they just have LAB data. They get a good LAB match to the standard that I want here, right? And they make that label. I've got another guy who's printing a folding carton with a knockout for the window. I'm going to drop this bottle into this box, and you'll see the label through the window. You with me?
Yeah, I'm totally on board. Yep.
Okay, so this is collateral stuff here. The box guy, that's a different ink guy. Okay, he's doing offset inks and everything here, and the label guy did Flexo, whatever, right? Well, he goes off of LAB, and he also gets a good LAB match, but it's not a good spectral match. Okay, they end up with very different spectral curves, but they still end up with the same LAB. Well, what they'll see when they visually QC this in a viewing booth, everything we're talking about here is D50, right? These are going to match in a viewing booth. They're going to get a thumbs up, and that thing's ready to go. Now it goes to the store floor, and suddenly the label flopped over to the green side, and the box flopped over to the red side. Now we got something that looks totally different, and now the customers are looking at this and questioning the quality of this product.
What advice would you give a designer or a pre-media, pre-press operation that require and need to maintain updated Pantone libraries within creative applications like Adobe Creative Suite or possibly Quark Express? How can they easily maintain current, up-to-date Pantone colors? Pantone adds new colors to the libraries continually, and we need to stay abreast of these new changes or new additions.
So Adobe ships with the 2010 libraries and currently, and everything that's in there is still valid data. But what's going to be missing is any new colors we've added to the libraries. There is a tool from Pantone called the Pantone Color Manager that allows you to take a look at these libraries and actually import the newest libraries. It stays up to date all the time. So it always has access to whatever the latest and greatest libraries are that are available. So you can use that to update your libraries. The other thing that's important, though, with those applications is, again, as I talked about earlier, the fact that the numbers in the published guides for CMYK builds are not the same as what you're going to see in your applications. And this is by design. This is not by flaw. Okay, a lot of people are like, "Oh, this is all broken," right? This is by design. The CMYK part of the guides is printed. We've done G7 calibration of our presses. We've printed the CMYK portion of the bridge guides, complying with the Grackle 2013 with the substrate correction. So those numbers you see in the book are based on hitting Grackle 2013, but also based on our specific paper color.
Right, and that's where you apply substrate correction because you have a specific paper color. Exactly.
And that's normal for G7 production, right?
Absolutely.
We're not doing anything, some secret sauce here or anything. Now, when you go into your Adobe applications, what's your default color space for CMYK?
Very, very old US Web Coded Swap V2. That's archaic and frustrating.
Yeah,
it's crazy. Yeah.
And
Adobe,
who uses that anymore?
Adobe. Please stop it. I mean, seriously, it's been over a decade and going on 2 decades that these default settings, color settings in Adobe Creative Suite have not been updated, have not been changed to align to industry specifications that are currently in use, like Grackle 2013. Makes very little sense because it's not a huge development lift. It's a simple update for default settings. Many issues and wasted money would be resolved quickly with that little color setting change.
Yeah, well, and the thing is that they don't even have to change they could do kind of a soft change here. They don't actually have to change the default. They could leave it in there, but at least have one of the presets to match current industry standards. So you just select a preset and it sets your RGB and CMYK and everything, Idea Alliance has those color
presets
settings files, right? I remember years ago I helped assemble those along with others for distribution. But people have to go to Idea Alliance and download those. If we had those embedded in the application, so you'd go in there just to select that right out the box instead of having to go download something and add it, that would be far better. But yeah, running with the defaults, again, right out of the box, it's not going to match what we've got in our book, okay? Because it's a very different print condition than we use for our book, right?
Yes.
And I think a lot of designers aren't even aware of the fact that when you select a Pantone color and you say convert to CMYK, it's going through that CMYK profile that you've got set in your preferences. They assume that it's hardwired in there, and they must be wrong. But if you switch that CMYK profile to, say, Grackle 2006 or 2013, depending on communication with your printer, what they're doing, you're going to find that the numbers in your conversion in your Adobe app are going to be much closer to what we have in the book. They're going to be just a little bit off, because again, our paper color is a little different than that of the standard, so it's going to tweak it just a little bit. But it should be very, very close. In fact, if you were to use one versus the other, you probably wouldn't see a huge difference. But we don't recommend changing those numbers in there. That's another mistake that I'll see people do, is they'll do the conversion and then they'll literally open up that color and then type in the color values they get out of our book.
And that's a bad practice, correct?
Bad practice. Have you seen that too?
All the time. Matter of fact, it happens all too frequently. One scenario comes to mind, the most extreme, and a commercial printer was going to throw a brand new digital press that they purchased, had it for a few months, and they were looking at litigation and getting rid of the newly purchased digital press. It turned out that the problem was colors from their cash cow account, their major customer, which a brand who had a corporate logo, was a hue of red. They could not produce this Pantone red on the digital equipment. And the customer was threatening to take the work and give it to another printer that had a digital, and big problem. And they couldn't resolve it. Turns out we did an audit, did a little investigation, and that the customer was supplying files and forcing the printer to use a specific CMYK build for that Pantone color, that red that they had been using in Allset. This is, part of their brand identity guide. And of course, the resolution was to stop doing that and simply supply the file with the Pantone as a fifth color so that the digital engine could convert it correctly, because that CMYK process is much different than the build that they were supplying within the file.
Exactly. So you do... what you described there, I have seen this too, where the brand owner dictates you must print this CMYK value to hit this Pantone color, and they're expecting the printer to hit that, even though they're printing to a different print condition. But they have to use those numbers and match it. It's not possible, and that's where it's really important you have communications between the print buyer and the print supplier to understand, well, what conditions are we printing under? Who's going to make the conversion to that print condition? So if you don't have control of that and you're sending work out to a lot of different suppliers, then you really need to communicate to them, hey, I'm expecting you to hit, Grackle or Swap or whatever, have that communication. That's what my expectations are. Or like we said earlier, if you are printing to a custom condition, like extended gamut, or you're doing, flexo printing on white film that doesn't hit Grackle exactly, and you had to create your own custom CMYK and all this stuff, let the converter do those conversions. That shouldn't be done upstream by the creator.
Mark, you've written a bit on blogs concerning extended color gamut, expanding CMYK process to 7-color process, from 4-color process to, widen the ability to reproduce more spot colors effectively. And the considerations in the label and packaging market, there's a lot happening in that particular manufacturing sector of the print industry, where label manufacturers, flexible packaging manufacturers, converters are taking advantage of some of the best practices for color management, like applying G7 and targeting specifications. And these have been used in Offset quite efficiently. And talk to me about that particular area of the business.
A lot of converters are starting to work with either their own in-house pre-media or they're working with pre-media companies, and they're starting to do more around achieving G7 kind of work. They're starting to use some of the new CRPC targets.
CRPC 6 and or the whole, So ISO 15339. Yep, the data sets within that. Yes.
Exactly. So we've got, a wider range there. So there's smaller gamut data sets there, and there's larger ones that go, larger and smaller than Grackle and SWAP.
Yeah.
Okay. So they've got a wider range to pick from. So starting to go with those. And actually, I've been pleased with and surprised, I have to admit, in some cases, with the Flexo guys, like that example I gave of, printing on white film. I've hit SWAP and Grackle on white film using Flexo process.
That's fantastic. How did you do it?
It wasn't real magic. It's actually just communication with the ink company, where they, would provide us with inks that fell on the hue angles that we were expecting from SWAP. Okay. And then just working with the guys to try to find, the combination of analogs and sticky tape and everything to get to the size gamut of SWAP or Grackle and the dot gain that we require, and they just basically lock down, establish this is the settings on this press to achieve that, right?
Yeah.
And then with that actually, they did this because they wanted to make it easier for themselves. They didn't want to have a custom print condition that they had to convert all their files to. And they also didn't want their press operators pushing color around on press. So if they said, hey, we'll shoot for a target of Grackle, let's say, and then they communicate that with their pre-media people and their designers, everything starts out as Grackle and just goes all the way through with a lot more predictability, right?
Wonderful. And that's what we're really shooting for. We're able to predict as opposed to being constantly reactive. And, in Flexo with Analux and Dr. Blades and, the environmental considerations with waterless ink, we have, limitations compared to Offset as far as moving color around. So you really have to get that thing set correctly as far as your conditions first. And then having the target totally makes sense. And,
exactly.
Now,
before we jump off that, I would like to add, like you just mentioned, there are certain things where you have inks that are fit for the purpose, whether it's rub resistance, food safe, that kind of stuff, that are going to limit that ability to hit, say, Grackle or SWAP, right? You're going to be different hue angles, right? In those cases, you will have to have you may have to have a custom print condition. Okay. But again, communication here, if I know that in order to get the best gamut, the best color out of my press, I have to go slightly off standard like that. I need to communicate with my pre-media people and make sure that we build a good profile around that. And we do the custom conversions, but that's not going to be something that you're going to expect, say, the designer to do that far upstream. You're going to have pre-media managing that to make the plates for that condition, right?
Yep. Often my raw materials are immutable, but I can't apply G7. So for whether it's in Flexo or any other technology, do you see an advantage of going to the basics of calibrating to G7 gray balance and tonality aims if I'm somewhere in between, let's say a specification like Grackle 2013, I can't achieve it, but I don't want to dumb it down to, let's say, uncoated or SWAP. I'm somewhere in between one of those areas, but I know that I can get very good, acceptable shared visual appearance by applying G7.
Actually, just a recent example. I was at a narrow web label printer, and they were doing everything with the Adobe defaults. They were doing all their own pre-press in-house. It wasn't even a third-party pre-media company. They were doing it all in-house. And they got stuff. They converted to the default in the Adobe applications. They sent it out to the press, and their press operators were responsible for pushing color around until they got it to match, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And it was a nightmare. In fact, their standard operating procedure included things like switching out different sticky back on different cylinders or different plates rather to try to accommodate different dot gain, things like this. And it's not, you shouldn't be coloring on press. And, like if you're doing the G7 calibration and you're establishing, it is a custom target you're going to create here, but it's G7, based. And then you, like you said, you build a profile based on that condition, and then you work with doing your conversions internally to that custom press condition. You're doing all the color work upstream, prior to making the plates, so that you get predictable results. And then you can take jobs in the future. Let's say your conditions should change. Suddenly that ink is no longer appropriate for the use. It's whatever, and you have to switch it out. Then you simply reconvert the file to that new press condition, and it should be ready to run again. Rather than having these guys on press constantly pushing color around. That's not. And the thing is, as you've probably experienced as well, is that the further down the process you are, the more expensive it is to fix the stuff, right?
Yeah,
so
perfect.
Right. So at the press, obviously, it's more expensive to be running that press, wasting materials and time at the press stage. Mm-hmm. But if it ends up that he can't get that color right, and then they end up pushing it back to pre-press anyway, because I need a bump curve or whatever on this thing, right? Then you've slowed it down even worse, and it's going to become more expensive. You've got more people touching it again.
I want to switch gears here, and I'd love to discuss with you the manufacturing process behind the Pantone guides, the swatch books, the CMYK Bridge, the Pantone Solid Guide, the extended color gamut guides. And when I worked for Koenig & Bauer, we customized a press for the Pantone facility there in New Jersey. So it was a customized press with split ink fountains. And we, in fact, in 2000, I believe it was 2007, 2008, visited the plant to implement G7, assisted the staff there to implement G7 on those customized presses. So talk to me about how you guys are doing process control, how you're manufacturing the current guides.
Yeah, I'd love to, because we've actually been doing a lot of work on even tightening the quality control even more. Just in the last couple of years. So as you described, we've got a press that has a split fountain that instead of running each of the spot colors in line, they're side by side.
Right.
Which is pretty crazy to watch these guys loading ink on this split fountain with these little narrow areas to put the ink in on the press. And there's a video somewhere on our webpage that shows what that looks like. Might take a look there.
Yes.
So these guys are running the actual formulated spot colors in that fashion on that split fountain press, and we've actually more recently, and this is not a sales pitch, but just understand where we actually implemented a way that we can actually take our instruments and software to scan across all of those colors and get immediate feedback on those color values, and the guys will adjust the density on press up and down until they hit it. If they can't get it within a certain tolerance on press, then they can actually, right out of the software, they can kick out the CXF, the spectral data of what we've measured on press, and we can send that back to our ink room. And then in the ink room, they can make adjustments to that ink and replace that ink on press if needed. So
That's amazing. Yeah. So where does the scanning take place? Is it somewhere in between the units on the impression cylinder, or how are we collecting that
It is
data?
offline. We'll pull sheets immediately from the press, and we've got a table that we've modified specifically to allow for our instrument to slide across. It's the Exact that we're using.
Yeah.
And we're measuring into ColorCert, where we've got all the colors set up there. But the operator pulls it, measures it immediately, and looks at the he's got a screen that highlights what's passing, what's failing, so he can immediately drive into where things are failing and drill down to see what the problem is. There's graphics on there that provide him with guidance on how to get to the best match with a density adjustment.
Right.
And so then there's a separate guy doing this color measurement and analysis, and he feeds that information to the press operator and asking him to raise the density up or down by how many points, kind of thing. And then the operator will make that change, and he'll run some more sheets and pull it and so on. But it's a pretty crazy make ready, and that we're being super picky on a large number of spot colors. Nobody is running 28 spot colors on a job except for us. Very specialty kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So whether it's a formula guide or a bridge, but it's the formulated side of the bridge that we would print in this fashion that I just described. The other piece is done on a CMYK press, and that one, as you mentioned, it's G7 calibrated, and there too we are measuring on that as well. It's a big challenge there to manage the CMYK stuff there. We actually do use the press forms kind of. I put this. The press forms are different than a lot of typical printing, because if you think about how we're laying down ink to create these colors, you're going to have parts of the press where we're using a lot of ink, and then others we're using very little, right?
Ghosting issues, starvation. So
yeah,
tricky.
So it's a real challenge there. So dealing with that ink starvation in different areas and such, we've actually used some tools from our sister company Esco to create a special takeoff bar, basically, that goes to help kind of balance that a little bit for us.
Right.
And we've seen some improvements based on using that as well.
So we've covered the Pantone solid guides as well as the CMYK bridge using G7 as a calibration method for the CMYK process. And what about the extended color gamut guides that are produced? Are you following a specific process by applying G7 for the CMYK and then the OVG inks? Explain to me the calibration methodology used to produce the ECG guides.
We did do the G7 calibration on that press for the CMYK. Then the additional extended gamut colors on those, we did basically a linear calibration using an older method called delta E to P, because that was prior to
SCTV.
That's right. It's prior to SCTV. It behaves pretty similar, but it is different. So we use that to curve those plates. We've got a good representation of how color can be converted to a condition that's basically Grackle plus extended gamut colors, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, there too is, I'm glad you brought that one up, is that doesn't mean that you're going to be able to get that exact match of those colors on every printing condition, right? Because in essence, we're looking at Grackle plus, okay? Grackle plus orange, green, violet. If your particular printing condition is a flexo press running on uncoated paper, or, you're, heaven forbid, you're printing on white craft or something like that. Yeah. No, you're not going to get the gamut there. Just because you have the additional colors doesn't suddenly make it everything that we got out of that ECG guide, right?
Right.
The intention there is to show what colors can safely be converted to a large gamut output. Say swap or Grackle. Can I predict that I'll even get a good match? And the beauty there is that adding those extended gamut colors to the production is we got very good matches across a very large number of the colors in the book. So if you look at your ECG guide and compare that, I like to compare it with the bridge.
Yes.
I like to use the bridge with that one, right? It's a great set there because you can look at how is it a formulated ink, how does it look on CMYK, and how does it look on CMYK orange, green, violet. And all of those are, the CMYK is all, based on Grackle. Right?
Yes. And it's something that not only, the printers and the smart G7 master printing facilities with the G7 experts on staff and, top-notch pressmen can use. It's also something that brands and people upstream in the supply chain can take advantage of. Mark, what is your role and responsibilities at X-Rite working? Obviously, you have a tremendous background and work with some of the finer aspects of reproducing color, whether it's Pantone, spot colors, ECG, or CMYK process. But give our listeners an idea and a background on what you do for X-Rite.
So, with X-Rite, my title is a solutions architect. And that means I do a lot of work with mostly large converters that have a lot of different locations, or some cases just more advanced applications that some printers or converters need to do. They'll bring me in to help them look at their workflow and try to figure out what kind of tools or techniques can be brought to bear to improve their process. In some cases, it's not even tied to a sale of one of our products. It might be going in and helping someone understand more about G7 or just simple process control. It might be a matter of training their operators to understand color. Understanding again, like understanding why we care about spectral data and why LAB is sometimes not enough information. Those kinds of things. Do a lot of process audits where we'll go in and look at a workflow from the very beginning. What comes in the door? What do you do with it? Who do you hand it off to? What communications take place? How can we smooth this handoff through the chain and then assure that we're handing off good data right?
Mm-hmm.
And so all the way out to the press room. I've worked in the industry for a number of years, and I got my start as a commercial photographer eons ago. So all the way from the creation of these files through pre-press, and all the way out to the press room, the process control there. A lot of work with ink guys, helping them with their process control in there, working with the proper standards and QCing properly. So that's the kind of stuff I do. The other thing that I love is that I work a lot with our R&D guys to try to figure out how do we build tools to address the needs of the customers. I bring back a lot of voice of customer and share that with our development team to help them build better products.
Excellent, Mark. What does your near future look like? What is happening with you and X-Rite over the next 6 months to a year? If you can share that with us.
We've got we've had a lot of success with a lot of large programs with a lot of large multi-site converters lately, where they're implementing color management systems, process control systems, and they're standardizing across all their locations. They're really liking this for a number of reasons. They like the fact that they can use the data to report back to the brand owners that, yes, we're hitting the targets we promised to, and you can see it through our production, and here's a report on it, right?
Yeah.
They're also using it for internal continuing improvement programs. If you aren't measuring your production regularly, you don't know where you are. But if you're measuring daily on every single job, and you can look at trend lines and you can see, are we getting better? Are we getting worse? Where are our biggest problems? What's the what's the common denominator of these problem jobs that we're running? and learning from that and going in and trying to address those issues. That they're learning a lot from that and improving on efficiencies and qualities with it. And so for me, that means I get to travel pretty regularly, just about every week now. I'm on site helping people resolve these things. It's pretty exciting. I love to go in, and everybody's got their own issues they got to deal with, and I like to go in there and try to find ways to make our solutions fit their issues.
And Mark, on that note, we'll go ahead and close out the Gamut podcast for today. And I want to thank you for graciously spending the time with us and sharing your knowledge and experience with our listeners. And I also want to take the opportunity to thank X-Rite and Pantone for all the support that you've given ID Alliance and our membership over the years with equipment loaners for classes and courses, as well as providing intellectual horsepower in our print properties and colorimetric council meetings, as well as contributing to our efforts in improving standards and specifications for quality in the print industry.
I really appreciate the time. Thank you.
Excellent. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Gamut podcast. If you have ideas, suggestions, or would like to join us or even sponsor future podcasts, simply email me at jcollins@idalliance.org. That's JCOLLINS @idalliance.org. Take care and have a productive day.